What is colorism and how do you define it?
Hi, my name is Koa and I identify as biracial. I think about colorism as a distinct hierarchy that is anchored in a proximity to whiteness.
Interesting. I think colorism is internalized racism. I'm Calvin West and I am an American.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Maya. I use they, them pronouns and I'm Black. So I actually think that colorism existed before racism, and the fact that historically, for example, if you look at Europe or Asia, like serfs, peasants, people who were in the lower classes had to work and toil in the sun, and those who were royalty or aristocrats or whatever tend to be lighter skin. And so there has historically been a privileging of lighter skin over darker skinned individuals. But I think that with the onset of global white supremacy fueled by European colonialism, 1492 onward, it was then absorbed into racism.
Yeah, I completely agree as well. I identify as Iranian. As someone who's from like an Asian country that wasn't technically colonized, we even have colorism and that idea even without people coming in and telling us that. So it's almost like a preconceived idea that's in our heads.
I'm a mixed race Puerto Rican, and in the Latina community, you can understand it very much as a caste system where there is no shame to address darker skinned people by slurs.
Okay, there are personal consequences for colorism. There are also systemic consequences, and colorism has implications for public health, beauty, and all sorts of things in society.
Okay. So you said that you feel like it is internalized racism?
The blackest experience any Black person can have is another Black person telling them that they aren't Black. And that is something that happens to lighter skinned Black people because there's this idea and that I've lived a different life because I'm a lighter skin. And that to me is the most anti-Black thing you can do to anybody.
Maya, what are your thoughts on that? Sorry, I saw you had a little bit of a reaction there.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
So I think often when lighter skinned people talk about experiencing bias from darker skinned people, I think that my first thought is just like, remember that colorism is an ism. And like when something has that ISM, it means institutional power plus prejudice. Darker skinned people as a class of people do not have the ability, the institutional power to, for example, put you in prison for longer sentences because of being lighter skinned or, having less access to employment. There's actual statistics where like a darker skinned person with a master's degree usually has less employment opportunities or is less employable than a lighter skinned person who has a bachelor's. And it's not to say that like bullying is like, I know that hurts. Like it's like personal sentiment. I know that actually feels bad. But I think that it's important to remember when we're talking about whether racism or colorism or anything that's an ism, that there's an element of institutional power that is added on to the prejudice.
I do feel like when darker skinned people express their frustration to lighter skinned people, that their lives might be different, harder. I think you sort of have to acknowledge your privilege, or else it's very ignorant. Even though we're both Black.
What specifically does that mean? Like, I've had experiences in my life that have not been great. And I can assume that it's because of the color of my skin, right? We talk about these ideologies, right? Which I think we get lost in sometimes. And we have to just bring it back to reality of like, well, let's talk about your situation for a second. How has it affected you specifically? And the answers that you get are, I didn't get an apartment, I didn't get a job, I didn't get that promotion, which happens to everybody, right? They can always talk about somebody else and what's happened in history, but they can't talk about their own lived experiences. And that's important.
I have plenty lived experiences. I mean, we could go from like, for me, I'm in the beauty industry, the beauty world. So I get invited to influencer events. And if I look around and I'm the darkest Black person, there's still a problem there. You know what I mean? That's a perfect example of that. And you might not realize it, but white people, lighter skinned people, they might be more willing to approach you because you are of lighter skin. That's another personal thing that, have you realized that?
Yes, I can acknowledge that may be the thing. Here's the other thing that happens. The other side of that, the other perspective on that is that I've done a lot of things in the acting world. I've missed roles because I'm not dark enough. And there's a lot of Black people who don't know that. They have no idea that your skin tone is actually highly sought out for.
But I feel like that's acting. They're looking to fill a specific role. Whereas if you're just applying for a job, you know, a lighter skinned person might get that opportunity over a darker skinned person.
I get so many personal testimonials from young dark-skinned Black girls who are very detailed about how colorism affects their life. So obviously colorism is a systemic issue, but I think an important part of it is the personal battle like young Black girls endure. These girls are being bullied. Some are as young as 14, 13 years old, having really like mental health crises in middle school. Like there's also so much research about how colorism shows up like systemically. Like there's research on public health and the different health outcomes darker skinned Black people have as opposed to lighter skinned Black people. And there's one about pulse oximeters like being used during COVID and how the devices have a harder time registering darker skin. And you can imagine the implications for that. And we know that the Black community has been disproportionately affected by COVID in terms of like deaths. I don't think that evidence can be divorced from the anecdotes, you know, because the anecdotes just supplement that evidence. They help put that evidence into context. And I'm so like fascinated by like the growing like scholarship around colorism, because I think it's about time people treat colorism with the same seriousness they treat racism.
Lamar, what are your thoughts?
When you come with statistics like that, that's the kind of supporting arguments that we need, as opposed to kind of moving away from the anecdotal, in my opinion, right? Because we're talking about something so big and so huge that affects everyone who is alive. I'm in the middle, you know, colorism exists for sure. I just think there's a lot of confirmation bias in our personal experiences that might drive us right to that term when it could be a number of other things.
But she's talking about how particularly darker skinned women engage with structures, engage with power, engage with institutions. Per that exact point, there are continuing studies that show that in instances in which darker skinned women do report intimate partner violence, domestic partner violence, bruises on their body, strangulation marks are harder for police to see, nurses to see, physicians to see, because a lot about how they are trained and the way they interact with those victims are attuned to look for those marks on lighter skin tones. And so that also impacts a lot in terms of who is seen as the victim, who gets resources, who gets proper medical attention. A lighter skinned woman who presents like I do, who walks in with something that reads very clean cut, is likely to get more attention in an already deeply misogynistic and racist and sexist body than a woman who is much darker than I am.
So they seem to have presented a lot of evidence and studies. Are you changing your mind at all?
As well as self-lived testimony, as well as anecdotal evidence. It goes back to how you feel about yourself.
I feel like it sounds like you're saying racism is like a choice almost.
How you respond to racism is absolutely, and I know that that's uncomfortable. I love it. This is my wheelhouse. Trust me. How you respond to racism is a choice. I'm
hearing, particularly on this side of the room, this idea that you can make an individual choice outside of the context of history, culture, politics, structures. I don't believe that personally. I think when anybody buys a certain product, styles themselves a certain way, decides to not style themselves a certain way, read a certain book, use certain words in a job interview, approach a politician, I think all of that is informed by history, literally all of the time.
We don't want to talk about anybody's individual experiences of it unless it's an experience that is affected by colorism in the way that you guys are comfortable with it. Colorism also happens on the other end. When I talk about the internalized racism and how lighter skinned voices, they don't get heard, they don't get pushed out there within the Black community, that I get eye rolls, I get, you know, people, there's a reaction to that is very negative and not welcoming. And
I'm not in the business of denying people their lived experiences, like who am I? But I think we can also acknowledge that those things happen. Like lighter skinned people have like certain experiences where they feel invalidated because of their complexion. And we can also...
Can you acknowledge that colorism affects lighter skinned people?
There's no such thing as reverse colorism. Same way there's no such thing as reverse racism.
Welcome back to Breakdown Friday. Joseph Ward, Patrick Irvin, Professor Carl Tone Jones. And we back again talking about the topic of colorism. We talked about it a while ago. But we're back on because I ran across this video of a group of I don't like the title, but minorities date colorism, like minority whatever. But it's a debate on colorism. It's interesting because there's a lot of feelings and misconceptions within this conversation that they're having. I've sided with the bald head guy with the glasses. I'm siding with him. He seemed like he has a good grasp on history and what's really happening in the world, as opposed to all the other people telling you about. They're giving you a Black experience through their feelings rather than giving a true Black experience that is not just encapsulated in somebody's emotional ties to what has happened to them. So we're going to dive deep into this because there's a lot of stuff that was said that was wrong, and there's some stuff that was said that was good. So PC, man, let's start with you, my brother. Let's start with you. So overall, what's up? Like, what's up with this, man? What's up with this colorism debate? What are your thoughts on the information that was exchanged?
Hey, you go to the light skinned person first, Joe.
Hey, man, reverse colorism, right? You can't.
Down with the patriarchy. Damn it. Down with the patriarchy. So, you know, when I watched that video, and I hate panels like that, I ain't gonna lie to you, man. Because first and foremost, you know, make sure my mic is right so y'all can hear what I'm saying. First and foremost, I just think there was a race to see who could be the biggest victim in those conversations. And I hate those situations where people feel like they can get impassioned and evoke your emotional heartstrings just based on something that's going to come out of their mouths, specifically when, you know, it could be something really vile. And I'm not saying what they say was vile, but what I am saying is they wanted you to buy into the passion. They wanted you to buy into the emotion, but they didn't have any real facts. They had personal experiences.
And a lot of what ifs.
Right. So I'll start at the end when the sister said there's no such thing as reverse colorism. I'm like, what?
Well, the thing is, what institutional power?
Hold on, Joe.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, PC. I gotta play moderator because Joe amp.
Joe was like, my gas pedal. You start off at 60. All right. So, but because I have it personally, you know, in my personal anecdotal experience, I've been on that side, and I'm growing up in North Philadelphia, being one of the biggest, lightest people. My name was Light Bright. My cousins had a particular fun activity. Just to, you know, once in a while, they would say, "Hey, yo, your pop just left," and I go outside and it'd be the mailman. You know what I'm saying? I get stuff like that. You know what I'm saying? You get to be the white sheep of the Black family. And you do get ostracized for being light skinned. I got in so many fights just because dudes thought girls like me. So now I gotta fight you. You know, it was like that scene on New Jack City where Wesley Snipes stabbed Chris Williams in the hand. Pretty mother, you know what I mean? So you get that part of it too. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that culturally speaking, that I had to deal with what a lot of my darker brothers and sisters had to go through. So, you know, I never carried that with me. But one of the things I will point out is that it didn't just happen amongst several groups of individual cultures and people. This was all started sort of like at the fulcrum or sort of like at the end of the Renaissance age of white supremacy, when they started to begin their global dominance. We can even go as far back into the mid-19th century with the whole concept of eugenics and how it was based in race. The lighter you are, the more intelligent you were considered as a group of people. The darker you were as a group of people, the more so you were considered inferior, and in fact considered to be the dregs of society. We can go to social Darwinism because Francis Galton who was the father of eugenics, and Charles Darwin, who was the father of social Darwinism. They were cousins, and they worked off of they based their work off of each other. I believe eugenics came around first, and Darwin started and
He used his work to justify.
Yeah, right. He used his work to justify social Darwinism. So that was part of it. There's another aspect, and see, this is why it's real important to read, learn, and understand before you open your mouths. When you go and you learn about the reason for light skins people getting privileges, a lot of it had to do with lineage. Specifically, if you had somebody whose child might have been the product of, grape culture and slavery, or grape culture and colonization, those particular lineages were based more so on bloodlines. So you were considered an octoroon or quattroon or whatever. All those things was based on how close you were to actual whiteness. The colorism that took place amongst the black the Negroes or the black folk who were in those particular groups, that was because you had a bunch of people scrapping for crumbs. It wasn't about a power grab, it was survival at that particular time. So internally speaking, they utilized it for privilege. I'm not justifying it, legitimizing it. I'm just telling you how it happened. Now, when you talk about countries like in Asia, India, things of that nature, they were trying to mimic white culture everywhere else. You talk about the Latino countries. Well, Latin is not a race. Latinos are not a race. Latinos are the byproduct of racial mixtures.
But all of this happened after colonialism.
Right. So for the ignorance that was expelled during that, I found it to be quite rich. There were some other things too. Just one other thing I wanted to point to. Because I started off with it. This whole notion of feeling like you want the privilege of being the victim. It has never worked. It has never truly garnered sympathy. And you can't show me anywhere in history where just being a victim actually helped people solve their problems that they were dealing with in those regards.
Man.
With that, I'll land my plane.
Right. What institutional power do light-skinned black people have? That's what I want the young lady to explain to me. Because in order to have, because the way she's framing it, like reverse colorism, like it's reverse racism, that would imply, because she implied that light-skinned black people have access to institutional power. Where did they get it from? What institutional power do light-skinned black people have? That's what I want to know, because she talked about it. She framed it as if light-skinned black people were a power class of people. Yeah. Privilege and power are two different things. Privilege comes from power. If light-skinned black people have privilege, who gave them that privilege?
Down with the patriarchy.
Yeah. And that was one of the things I actually scribbled real quick in my notes was she did not do her argument any favors when she used that, because you're saying anytime you're dealing with an ism, you're dealing with privilege and power, institutions, things of that. Okay. Privilege is something given to you by the group. Privilege is something that's given to you by those with the power to give you something. So why would you be mad at the people being given something instead of being mad at the people identifying and then being frustrated with the people doing the giving? So, and by that definition, you run into this other question. If that's how we want to define isms, the other girl talked about misogyny. Well, on the other side of that is feminism. So who's giving Where's the privilege and the power in that particular ism? And so we run into all of these when you start, and that's where just having this conversation, people make up these words and apply these definitions, and then lay people use them, and then it makes a mess. I thought it was interesting because, like you just pointed out, Joe, colorism, and PC made this same, like PC made a lot of points that I was thinking about making, but I wasn't sure how I was going to word them, especially with regards to saying colorism predates racism.
That's
not the colorism we dealing with here in America.
That's insane. No, but what I want her to show us what type of colorism she was talking about, because I don't know what type of colorism she's talking about.
She can't, because as PC said, prior to European dominance being established in the world, there was a different dynamic at work. And we can see evidence in various African nations where dark-skinned people were considered the standard. So I think this whole conversation, the way it's being had, is counterproductive, because instead of us identifying that both, and then we've had this conversation, light-skinned people have a different set of struggles than dark-skinned people.
Right.
Not worse,
right.
Not better, different.